Welcome back from the break, everyone. Thank you for sticking with us to another episode of Independent Thought. For today's episode, I am being joined by Sarah Bolstad, the host of the I Speak Dead People podcast. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
Oh, thanks for having me. This is awesome. This is great. I'm excited. I'm doing pretty well, despite, the smoky environment we live in now, just permanently. And I just feel so weird. I'm like, no wonder everybody in LA is just a bunch of, they're so crabby all the time. It's like they live in smog constantly. It just sucks.
Yeah,
So
the air quality here in Missoula, Montana is less than desirable, to say the least.
I know.
Yeah.
It's like I've lived here 13 years or something, and I remember it used to be this like big extravagant thing, like, oh my God, there's fire this year, there's smoke this year, and now it's like, oh no, this is just how we live. So it's like,
oh my God, don't get me started.
Sucks.
I will go on a long rant about.
Uh-oh.
But yeah, no, it's unfortunately the climate around here has definitely been changing. It's a part of the unfortunate times that we're living in, and you're going to hear a lot of my thoughts on that in the upcoming weeks. But in regards to you and your podcast, I Speak Dead People. Whenever I have a podcaster come on, it is tradition that I ask about, your podcast first and foremost. And so I want to know, why exactly did you start I Speak Dead People? And for those who have no idea what your podcast is, can you tell us a little bit what it's about?
Yeah. Okay, so I feel like there's a real long answer I could give you, and I'll give you one. But I Speak Dead People is a podcast where I have guests come on the show, and we talk about the death of our loved ones, of our family members, and all the crazy shit that happens to us in grief. And I started it after losing my dad 8 years ago to leukemia. And, in those 8 years, I've discovered so much about myself and life and people that I just felt that it deserved more of a platform to talk about it, because it's not something we're talking about. I can almost, bring it back to your podcast. Like, a common theme here is there's these huge life events happening and it's not being covered. And, no one's talking about it, or it needs more, we need a way to talk about it, a safe place to talk about it. And instead of, being told how to feel about it, with the information that we're fed on the news or the media, this is like just a real life podcast of what you go through when you lose somebody. So, and I can come back to how that like relates to death, but, so I think it all starts back from when I was a kid. So I grew up in a small Northeast Montana town, and, without making it seem like it was the Wild West over there, I mean, there was a lot of tragedy that happened in the small town. I knew a lot of people who died. There were car accidents, freak accidents, a lot of cancer. And although it was happening all around us, it was like, we weren't really talking about it. Like, it was like, God, that's terrible. And that's terribly tragic. And those poor people and these poor families. But when it came down to really being able to process what was happening, there wasn't that form of discussion happening. And, I can kind of attest to just reading about trauma and learning about trauma in my adult life, and just how those are traumatic events, and your brain needs to like put that into compartments and be able to figure out what to do with that. Because if you don't, I mean, it can like lead to a life of anxiety, which is like what happened to me. but then this hit a lot closer to home when I lost my dad to leukemia. Like I said, he was diagnosed with leukemia when I was 21. And I mean, from the time that he was diagnosed to the time that he died, we had over a year and a half to talk about like end of life discussion. And do you think he and I ever did? We never did once, until he died that day when I was with him. And it's like, why was I shoving that into like this, his last 10 minutes of his life, when I could have just been doing that when he was alive? And it's because it comes back to that whole, like, the rhetoric of death, the, society's take on it. Death is scary, death is tragic, death is final, blah blah blah. It's, don't talk about it, it's awkward, it's weird. And because of that, like, terrifying approach that we all take on death, it's like my dad and I didn't get to talk about any of it. We didn't know how.
Right.
And it's like, maybe if we just had more of a normal, like, idea, just a normalized way to discuss this stuff. It's like, he and I could have had these conversations, but we live in a society that silences it, really. And maybe so, like, other families have better communication than mine did, but we just didn't. And then also, I say it created this complex for the rest of my 20s, because when my dad died, I just, like, lost my shit, from like
Right.
23 to 30. Like, I was just like, okay, this is going to be my time to just be like, try to figure this out, and in doing so, it's like messy. Like, I did a lot of stupid shit. I moved all over the place. My poor friends, like, the only time I could talk to them about it is when I had finished a bottle of wine and I'm like crying. It's just like, no, I don't need to be talking about my dad dying after I've finished a bottle of wine. Can't I just, like, talk about it on a hike with a friend? But I just, like, I didn't know how.
Right.
And I also felt so much shame about it. All the things that I was doing, all these feelings that I was having about my dad dying. It's like, I was, like, so ashamed of myself. And it's like, you don't have to be ashamed of being crazy for a little while. This stuff makes you crazy. And maybe if we just, like, put it out there a little bit more, it wouldn't, like, manifest into this craziness. But so that's why I've, like, created this. It's just a safe place to talk about it. It normalizes all this stuff. So
Yeah, and it's something that when I first found it myself, I was very conflicted about listening, because it was just like, wow, that's such a heavy topic. Like, do I want to approach something, that is about grief and about death and the trauma that can come with that? But it is a very important topic to cover. So I'm glad that you are doing that. I think, one of the things that we had talked about previously when we spoke about this, you said that one of the themes of your episodes is finding commonalities, through our struggles. And could you just tell me a little bit about, like, why is that important for you, or why do you think that should be important for all of us?
yeah, I think, like, a huge realization I had, like, when I talk about being so ashamed of myself and, like, carrying all this guilt and even sort of, like, resentment towards my dad and I's relationship. Just like, why weren't we talking about it when we had the chance? Like, it was right there. But it's like this situation, like losing my dad and death, is not unique to me. Everybody's going to lose somebody one day. If it hasn't happened to you yet, it will. And as terrifying as that sounds, we can't control these things in our lives. And so when I hear these people talk, and I listen to their stories and what they go through, it's like, we all have to figure this shit out together. Like,
Right.
we do. And it also helps us understand each other a little bit more. I think that's something in this world where we're so connected, but we're so distant. Like, we really are just so misunderstood because it's so superficial. Our relationships are so superficial anymore. And it's like, no, we're so connected on all this stuff. And it's things we don't have to wake up in the middle of the night about feeling, freaked out about or having anxiety about. It's like, I bet you, if you're struggling about this, I bet you someone is struggling as well. And, when you put it out there, it's like, it makes you feel a little less crazy when you put this stuff into words.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that when I personally was dealing with losing a loved one, a few years ago, I had no idea how to talk about it. I had no idea how to talk about it. I had no idea how to process it. And it is such a taboo in our culture. I mean, it feels like it's something that you don't talk about with your friends, and you barely talk about with your loved ones. So it's definitely something that does need a little more normalization in my mind. But speaking of which, when you do find people who are willing to come on your show and talk to you about all of this, like how exactly does that process work? I mean, how do you find guests? Like, do you find guests or do your guests find you? Tell me about this a little bit.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like, I bring up the small town that I lived in, and I knew so many of those people, all these stories that in my head were just like these crazy tragedies that I had just lived with, but I had never talked to them one-on-one about it before. And so a lot of my early guests were people from my hometown. And so I would just reach out to them. And
Yeah.
at first, like, can you imagine? Hi, I'm starting a new podcast. I've never done this before, but I hope you want to come on and talk about this most tragic part of your life. Like, like talk about me, like pushing the
Yeah.
send button, and I would just like throw my phone against the couch and just start like pacing around the house. I'd be like, I'm an idiot, and like, like, and so.
Uh,
But it's funny because as much as you just do that to yourself, like create this like, oh God moment, they respond and they're like, yeah, this sounds awesome. Like, are you kidding me? Like, because do you know, like all these things that you go through in grief, it is
yeah.
such a big thing. It's one of the biggest things you could go through. And and people do want to share their story. Some people are like, hell no, I would never do that, like don't
Right.
ask me again, but but some people are so willing to share. And I think it also just um it you see how many people care about it too. Like, I thought, oh God, I hope, a handful of people listen or something. And then you see the numbers and you see people listening and caring and messaging me, or the families of the people that are on. And you just go, oh my God, like this is what life's about. This is what connection and relationships is about.
Yeah.
People do care about each other. And and then there's a lot of, okay, I'm running out of people that I know have lost loved ones. Like, now I'm just finding people on social media or something. But um yeah, it's a crazy process because we'll message each other for a little while. Some people are like, let's just message a couple times and let's just go, let's get this over with. Some people need like a month. But I ask a lot of the guests, let's start off by you writing me a brief story. Like, you say you want to do this, you sit down and let's see if you can do it.
Yeah.
And a lot of people sit down and they'll message me back and be like, I can't do it. I am not ready,
Right.
and when you're ready and when you're not. So it's like this. It's such a crazy mind experiment, really. But but yeah. So it's this funny process that I go through with the guests. But then after the fact, after we record an episode and I get to know these families and these people, it's like, for me, oh my God, like I can go through my Spotify playlist and like look back on the songs that I was listening to at that time. And I'll be like, that was an episode that I did with Todd. And that was an episode that I did with so-and-so and blah, blah, blah. And it's
Right.
just like, for like a week or two, I'll just be like, oh my God, like I dream about these people. And it's
Yeah.
like,
Spend a lot of
holy
time with
shit.
them.
Like, yeah. So and like you too, like the news is heavy. It's this is serious shit. This
Yeah.
is some heavy material. And so sometimes you do get a little exhausted. you know
Yeah,
like,
no, I could bet. And not only I'm sure that you're exhausted, but I'm sure that people that you're talking to also get exhausted. And I
yeah.
think one of the things you mentioned to me in the past was that some people didn't want to come on your podcast because they just didn't think that their stories are worth telling, and that you had to struggle basically trying to like convince some of these people that their stories are in fact valid. Like how did you kind of, I guess, like bridge that gap a little bit with some people about convincing them that their stories were worth telling.
Yeah, that's what's so crazy in our culture too, is this comparative culture that we have, that's just like, and I think part of my problem too in my 20s was just that I was like, well, I was an adult when my dad died. I should just get over it. Like, people
Yeah.
have way worse stuff that happens to them. And, of course, there's some losses that you could weigh a little bit differently than others, but like, if it means something to you, then it means something. So you have to figure out how to deal with it.
Right.
And you cannot brush it off just because someone else's death or someone else's tragedy seems worse than yours. And so when I would reach out to someone like a guest that I'm working with for the future, she's like, I didn't know him like I knew your dad and all this stuff. And I'm like, but that still has a profound, it still affects you in a way
Right.
that, like, you can't brush this stuff off. And so it does. I think even just me coming forward and asking them to be on the show, it makes you realize, like, oh, someone does care. Like,
Right.
someone remembers that about me. Like, if someone
Yeah.
were to ask me about my dad or something, I'd be like, you remember, that my dad died? Like, that would feel like, I would probably feel excited because, like, his memory stayed alive to somebody else but me. And it's like, I don't know. It's I think that's a huge part of it, is this comparative culture that we have in our society. And we have to stop comparing, because we will never embrace our personal stories if we just keep doing that to each other.
It's a very toxic thing that we all do. I think we're all guilty of it. I know I'm guilty of it. I think I was guilty of it just yesterday. So it is an ongoing thing. I was trying to mix on ongoing and occurring. Didn't work out too well. Uh, it is one of the things that came to my mind when I was thinking about all of this was, people do process grief differently. Some people, laugh about things. Some people go into a more reclusive place. Some people want to talk about it all the time. I feel like everyone kind of deals with this a little bit differently. But when you're sitting in that chair, in the host chair, and someone is sharing their experiences with you, how do you respond to it? Do you kind of take a more hands-on approach when you're talking to people about their grief, or do you kind of like sit back and kind of just let them process it, I guess, in a more like hands-off style? Like what is the preferred method?
Yeah. I think, you know, like, you probably imagine that some of these conversations are just like a lot of us just like crying, and we're really not. Like, I think when someone's just prepared, when they're mentally prepared and they know that they're going into this conversation to be in a space with someone who's like providing a safe place for them to do it, it creates it creates this environment where they're like owning the story, and there's like nothing more powerful than owning your story.
Yeah.
You can do anything when you own your story. And it's like, it's not some like sad, pathetic thing. Like, it's just like, yes, this is what happened to me during this really screwed up time of my life, or really sad and tragic time of my life. And like, I kind of made it out of the storm, and like, here I am, and that's what's so crazy about grief, is like, you can kind of think back to life before these tragedies happen to you, or before these losses happen to you, and you like won't even remember who that person is, and you're just
Right.
like, of course I wish my dad was alive, but I don't even know who I would be if he was still, like that. And that's like a roundabout way of answering your question, but it's like, yeah, when people are able to tell their story, it's so much different than what you would expect. And two, a lot of it, I do edit our episodes, because a lot of it is just like sitting back and processing some of this stuff, because you might be like mid-sentence with somebody, or someone's telling their story and they're just like, God, I didn't even remember that. Or, I didn't even remember that until now. And I think there's so much chaos in grief that
Right.
you do forget things. And so to be able to like sit down and really like relive this stuff, it does something to you. I know I interviewed one of my best friend, her dad died of cancer. Um and like I just thought I was going to interview her, and her and I are pretty goofy, and we just, we were like laughing the whole time, really, like
Yeah.
kind of in our sick little humor way, whatever. But like the rest of that week, I had no idea what it would trigger within me, like because I was reliving our stories were pretty similar, watching our dads die of cancer.
Yeah.
And the what I went through in that next week, I was just like, oh my God, like this is insane. But I'm also glad that I'm going there right now, because had I not, I wouldn't be figuring out that, what I've just kind of kept in a box and kept away in my brain. I'm letting that out and I'm processing it and I'm learning, and there's a lot of growth, when you
Yeah.
do, and you might not, it might come out without warning, but you can either be a victim to that, or you can just like own it, like I said, and you can process it and do something with it and come out a better person. So
Yeah, I have to imagine. I know that whenever I'm having somebody else come on and we're having conversations that involve life experiences or just personal accounts of what's happening in the world, there is like lessons, I guess, you trade with each other in real time. And so that's one of the things I wanted to ask you now is, you know, through all these conversations that you've had with all of your different guests, like what is, I guess, a lesson that you've taken from this experience that's kind of been impactful for the rest of your life?
yeah, I know all these things that like I wasn't expecting. I just thought, we need a platform to talk about death, because I'm realizing, this isn't unique to me. Everybody's going through this shit, and let's just like talk about it. But what I'm realizing is that I had so much anxiety just from, like having control issues. Like I had crazy control issues with my son going to daycare, or, like I just thought, oh my God, if he's at daycare, he's going to die, or like if, just like weird random shit that like you couldn't
Yeah.
look back and think, okay, that's because you're afraid he's going to die, because maybe, you have a little PTSD from your dad dying or so, like
Yeah.
something like that. But it's like, and what I said about how the media kind of feeds you how to feel about news and events and things happening in the world. Well, media also and society also does something to death. And that is like, it's sad, it's heartbreaking, it's scary. And death isn't always sad and heartbreaking and scary. We have to learn how to live with it. We have to, I love this quote off of the Mayor of Easttown on HBO. It's an excellent show, but she says you have to learn how to accept the unacceptable,
Right.
because it you have to. It's not like you can accept that, you know someone you love died, but you have to learn to live with the unacceptable. And it's like, um no, I'm like, oh no, I hear something. But there's all this stuff like that creates this scary culture around it, and it's like it's not as scary as they're making it out to be. Like, just because someone lost her husband, or lost her child or something, she's not just like this poor woman. She's a lot more than that, and we can still connect with her and be with her in these spaces together. We can still be friends with her and approach her at the grocery store. Like, it doesn't become every part of who you are on the outside, even though it does become who you are. But it's like,
Right.
it's not, I don't know, I feel like I'm like answering this in the weirdest way, but we don't have a relationship with death because we live in a society that silences it. And I had this like really great conversation with my sister-in-law who she lost her mom to she took care of her mom for a very long time, and her mom died, and she wound up having this like really beautiful burial, and was with her when she died. And she said to me, she said, maybe if we lived in a culture where we welcome death and we had to bury our young and we had to dig the grave of the person we're going to bury, if we had more of a relationship with this, then maybe little boys wouldn't walk into schools and shoot up the place. There wouldn't be mass murders. Maybe people, would wear their seatbelts because they would see how much it affects other people around them when they die. Like there's so much to that. And it's like, because we don't have a relationship with death, we don't, we do things that we probably wouldn't do regularly. I don't know, but it's always kind of stuck with me.
Yeah. And it seems like a necessary conversation to be having,
Yeah.
a very necessary one. I don't know exactly how we get from where we're at to there, but I know that it starts with having more conversations like this, normalizing this a little bit more, especially giving some grace to people who are going through the mental health issues and the trauma that kind of comes with these experiences in life. And I guess the last thing I want to ask you here is, what is your overall hope for someone who comes to your podcast? Like, what do you hope they'll take away after they've listened to an episode or a few episodes?
Yeah. I would just think like to not be afraid of it. And maybe, maybe you could say, well, I'm not afraid of it or something. And it's like, you should ask yourself, have you talked to your best friend about their dead loved one? Have you ever had a conversation with them, like your best friend? And I bet you a lot of people would say no, and like, or have you told your best friend like the crazy shit that you've gone through? It's just like a question to kind of put out there. And, there is a lot, like you brought up, mental health and all this stuff, but like, there's also just this deep shame spiral we can all go down when we feel these crazy feelings that we go through.
Yeah.
And it's nothing to be ashamed of, and I think ultimately what I've learned from this podcast is like to not be afraid of it. And also, if you're not okay with your life, if you're not in a good place in life or secure or owning your story, then you'll never be okay with your death. It'll be something you're so afraid of, you won't be able to talk to your husband or, whatever. It's like, you have to be okay with your life to be okay with your death. And I hope that like, if anyone can take something from that, it could change, it could change a terminal cancer diagnosis. Like, now I understand if I am diagnosed with cancer, to have these conversations with my kids and, my stepgirls and my son, and to have this conversation with my husband, and to have these things in place, because people have to go on after you're gone. They have to figure out how to go and how to keep moving forward. And it's like, yeah, it's something that if I can get anyone to take away from the podcast, that would be it.
And I will just add one last thing here because I'll mention that you and I did talk before this. I thought this was a beautiful thing to say, that we should all have compassion for one another because we're all going through something. I thought that was really a really nice thing to point out. So I kind of want to just give you a little extra credit there for that. Sarah, thank you so much for coming on today and talking about all of this. Can you just let everyone know where they can find you on social media and where they can find your podcast at?
Yeah, you can find me on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, any of the above, at I Speak Dead People. And then also on Facebook and Instagram at I Speak Dead People Podcast. And then check out my website, ispeakdeadpeople.com. And don't be afraid to reach out too. I love meeting new people. And if you have a story that you want to share, freaking, I love to hear about it. So, yeah.
All right. So for those who are interested, go ahead and click in the episode description below, and there will be some links for Sarah down in the description. Thank you again for coming on, and everyone else will be right back after our final break with my final thoughts of the day. Stay tuned.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.